Buenos días.
Días, muchachos.
Buenos días, chicos.
Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody in the back. Silencio, por favor. Buenos días.
Buenos días.
Buenos días. Todo aquí. We are welcoming you to the Contemporary Issues class. Today we take a little trip down south in Nicaragua and Latin America and talk a little about immigration, but much about the history and understand a little about the southern area.
Mucho historia.
Mucho historia with a class member, Eric, who's been there many times. And I will introduce Eric more in a moment. Any first-time visitors with us today? I don't think so. So we know each other. And our usual announcements for Zoomers, please mute yourself in the lower left corner of your screen. Nice to have you here. We are recording this for future playback. And Susan, can you still hear us okay? We're good? Good. All right. We'd like to check. And announcements. Any other announcements and things going on that we're not thinking of? Okay.
You got Big Sur next week.
Big Sur, that's right. Thank you, Steve. Yes, big service day next week. Hope you signed up for that. And some new classes starting too. Rev Mark has a class on process theology starting next week, I think. So there'll be a couple sections of that. I'll email you some information. May 1 and 8, I think. I think be tomorrow, so I'll email out details about it. Yes, that makes sense. That is good. Okay. Strange story in the sermon today about ski bears mauling teenagers, but nice that Mark explains the background there. In the original language, what these stories mean. Yes. Never take stories at face value, right?
I thought one of the takeaways was don't let bears get a hold of AR-15s. We can't one attack.
Yeah, right.
Well, a lot of damage.
Lateral
The ball guys were gonna have to make an attack on
Oh,
this.
We're making fun of ball people.
Yeah, I was taking offense there for quite a while.
But you did.
I just laughed and laughed. Wow.
Good.
Lots of laughing.
Hey, Steve,
That's good.
in Southern California, near San Bernardino, they have Mount Baldy.
That's right.
Yeah,
Baldness.
yeah.
Go back.
There you go.
For me, some of those stories have kind of always, stories like that in the Bible have kind of always been, you just kind of go, I'm not gonna even think about that if I'm going on to the next thing,
Yeah.
Right.
To understand.
But the fact that Mark explained about shaving their head for being in a warning and makes it so much more clear about
Yeah,
how to understand.
and the history of
Bible.
Bethel.
Oh, my goodness, so,
United Kingdom.
yeah, we are very fortunate to have someone that does that kind of research
Yes.
and teaches.
That is a Native American thing.
Yes.
Well,
So,
He has a knack of bringing it to us,
he does,
present day.
yes, yes.
Which I think is.
That's just good preaching.
yes,
Taking the Old
That's
Testament,
great.
New Testament,
Yeah.
bringing it forward to us.
very good.
And
Okay. Well, Eric Schmidt is a retired high school teacher, science mostly, did you teach?
Yep.
And
all science.
and now in your retirement, you're doing tour guiding. And you've traveled the world and how many trips to Nicaragua, Latin America?
At least 14.
Oh, wow. Has anybody else been to Nicaragua specifically? Or Latin America in general, other countries? Which countries? Tell us.
Guatemala.
Guatemala. Yeah, Steve did mission work in Guatemala.
Guatemala.
Yeah, Guatemala.
Guatemala.
Okay.
No, I haven't been to Guatemala, I've been to Costa Rica and Colombia and Texas.
Mexico.
It's Costa Rica, Brazil, Argentina,
Chile. Oh, I've done a lot down there, almost everything except Peru and Colombia. I don't want to go to Colombia.
Oh, Colombia's wonderful.
Oh, it is? It is?
They're the nicest people in South America to Americans.
I'll have to
Well, that's why we thought
see.
we thought we would tap Eric's experience and hear a little bit about it. We're not primarily gonna talk about immigration today, but we are gonna dip into that and ask Eric why so much immigration is coming from that area. What is the problem? What is the living condition situation? So, we're gonna have some slides and history, and so do you want to take questions while you're presenting? We'd like to hold the question.
Probably because it's so lengthy, you know, one of the unwritten rules of teaching is you always prepare more than what you think you're gonna need, so,
Okay,
really to get through it all, I think the questions at the end is probably better.
all right, we will.
Can you go to slideshow on there or not? 'Cause I'm just wondering how I can look at this.
Yeah. Then I just.
If I have to look over your shoulder.
To this side, you can do either. Let me hit my share screen first.
Yeah, under
I
slide.
know it's after. And. Then you go.
One of your degrees is marine biology too, right?
I taught that for 15 years, but it's not a degree. No,
Okay.
no, my degree is forestry.
Okay.
Yeah, I love trees.
Okay. Susan, can you see this slide now on your screen?
Yes.
Good, okay, thank you.
Can you go to slideshow?
Okay.
It was at the top.
At the top, slideshow.
There it is. Slideshow.
Okay,
It's a drop down there. I'm not seeing the drop down.
no, maybe on mine it doesn't do this. I can just click on the.
Okay, then
How
I'll
about
do
that?
that.
Let's just do that. Okay. Okay, ready?
Okay, this is
Take
just,
it away.
this is just an index for you to look at if you choose to look at this at a later time. I'm not gonna read it to you, but we're gonna begin with the Spanish conquest of Central or Latin America, beginning in Mexico. Actually beginning with Hispaniola, where Columbus landed. So next slide. Columbus's voyage ended the cultural and biological isolation of the Americas in 1492 with the collision of the old and new worlds, giving birth to what we now call Latin America. The same year that Spain finally ended a 700-year long battle to drive out the Muslims, who were called the Moors at that time, from Spain and Portugal. So this is really my go-to book on the history of Latin America and where I got this information. So I'll pass it around. I've read it 2 or 3 times, and every time I read it, I get something new out of it. That's my go-to book. Next slide. Hispaniola later becoming Haiti and the Dominican Republic. You know, the Dominican Republic was Spanish, and Haiti, of course, was settled by the French. Became the staging ground for Cuba, and Cuba became the staging ground for Mexico, the conquest of Mexico. Santo Domingo, founded in 1493, is where the oldest Catholic church in the Americas can be found. I visited there when I sponsored a boy in Santo Domingo, and so I visited there as part of visiting him, but then also visiting that church. It became the prototype design for all Spanish American cities. So it's laid out in a grid pattern, and the main square always has a cathedral on one side and the governor's palace on another side. Now in Mexico City, it's called the Presidential Palace or the House of Cortez. That's what they call it. And the current president, Obrador, I can't think of all 4 names, but anyway, the current president, that's where he's chosen to live, in the presidential palace on the main square, which is Zocalo, right next to the cathedral. Next. And the cathedral at Zocalo is right next to what was the heart of the Aztec or the Mexicas empire. So you have this place that I visited called Tenochtitlan. I bought this at the Anthropology Museum in Mexico City. And the Templo Mayor, or main temple, was the heart of this city before Cortez. When Cortez went there in 1519. And the next slide is what the, that's the Templo Mayor. Those are the ruins. What the Spanish did is they just leveled this temple, the main temple, the Templo Mayor. They leveled it, and you can see not very far away is where they built the main cathedral, which today is sinking. I'll talk more about that later, but I'll pass this around. Okay, and here is the Zocalo Plaza when it appears. The cathedral, and then the presidential palace, aka the House of Cortez. I'm not sure why that's not coming up.
Sorry.
Having trouble with the photos. Okay.
Not loading.
Yeah,
Sorry.
on the next slide, in the center of downtown Mexico City, the cathedral. It has sunk more than 25 feet because the original Tenochtitlan was built on a system of 5 lakes, 3 saltwater lakes, 2 freshwater lakes. And the Spanish built this huge cathedral, and so it settled 8 feet deeper on the tower's end, where the 2 towers, it settled 8 feet. So now they're in the process, I don't know if you'll see the picture, but they're in the process of, they've got scaffolding built all the way up to the top of these 2 towers to try to stabilize that church, because it's sinking, because the whole city, in effect, is built on crushed lake bed. That's what they've done. And so it's very susceptible to earthquakes, and overpumping of their groundwater. That's become a real issue in Mexico City. They've overpumped their groundwater, and it's already unstable to begin with, so the whole city is kind of sinking. And the city is 20 million plus city. Okay, so New Spain. These are the 4 viceroyalties, beginning with New Spain, of which Nicaragua is part of that. Peru, including Chile. New Granada. This came together under Simon Bolivar. You can't talk about the history of Latin America without talking about, he's called the George Washington of South America, Bolivar. In fact, I put a little sticky note. He says, this is toward the end of his life, America is ungovernable. This is what Bolivar said. He who serves a revolution plows the sea. All one can do in America is leave it. So he became very cynical at the end of his life. The country is bound, when he says the country, he means South America. The country is bound to fall into unimaginable chaos.
Well, that's coming true.
After he was a prophet, after which it will pass into the hands of an undistinguishable string of tyrants of every color. So that's what Bolivar said at the end of a long life of fighting not just the Spanish, but those who wanted to take over his leadership.
When did he live?
I'm not sure on his birth date, but he initiated the revolution in 1810, and it took 11 years for South America to break free of Spain. It was helped by other things that I'll mention also. Okay, so the 4 viceroyalties, again, this is a picture. The pictures aren't coming.
All right.
So it'll be in the PowerPoint, I guess, if he puts it online. Next. And now.
Sound out of the television.
Mexican and Nicaraguan independence. Independence wars, as I said, began in 1810, lasting until 1821, beginning with Creole discontentment, including Simon Bolivar, the liberator. He was from Venezuela, from Caracas. He was considered a Creole, which means that his parents came from Spain, and he was the firstborn of Spanish parents. They called them Creoles. Spain was defeated in 1908 by Napoleon, leading to the abdication of the Spanish King Charles, even as the Portuguese monarchy actually fled on British ships to Portugal. So the Portuguese monarchy lived in Portugal until the 1840s. It had left because of the invasion of Napoleon. So Spain was in big trouble and they didn't have the wherewithal to defeat this independence. Guatemala City Assembly approved the Declaration of Independence on September 15th, 1821, and that is considered Independence Day in Nicaragua and Guatemala. Nicaragua also declared that as Independence Day. Next. The United Provinces of Central America and the Monroe Doctrine. Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica came together in 1823, forming the United Provinces of Central America. It didn't last very long, but that same year, 1823, the Monroe Doctrine was articulated by the president to Congress. The European powers, Monroe said, were obligated to respect the Western Hemisphere as the United States sphere of influence. Don't mess with the Western Hemisphere is what this said. Internal conflicts led to the collapse of the Central American Union, and Nicaragua declared full independence in 1838. Okay, now this is really a peculiar story. The British and William Walker, they called him the filibuster. I don't know where they came up with that name. But in 1848, the British seized the Caribbean port of San Juan del Norte, renaming it Greytown. The discovery of gold in California drew attention to the strategic position of Nicaragua for inter-ocean traffic. And Cornelius Vanderbilt, Accessory Transit Company, began a steamship and carriage operation between Greytown and the Pacific. So to get to California faster, people would transit across Nicaragua, particularly Lake Nicaragua, which is huge, because they didn't want to go all the way around the Horn to get to California. And at that time, that was the best way to go. William Tecumseh Sherman traveled that route to his post in California. Mark Twain also traveled this route. Revolutionaries in Nicaragua recruited William Walker, a Tennessean, and with dozens of missionaries, he declared himself president in 1856. Well, he only lasted 1 year, but he was sweet-talked or seduced into coming to Nicaragua to oppose this Vanderbilt steamship company. On Walker's third trip, so he went back and forth, he landed in Honduras and he was taken prisoner by the British Navy, who then turned him over to Honduran authorities, who then executed him. So it's kind of a strange story. This is from the Britannica, was my source. Next. Let's see. Next slide, please. This period of neo-colonialism was defined by banana republics and gunboat diplomacy. U.S., this is where we really get involved. The U.S.-based corporation led by the United Fruit Company used bribery and other methods to gain support of local governments. The Dulles brothers became major shareholders in the United Fruit Company. So if you read this book, Legacy of Ashes, The History of the CIA, it talks about John Foster Dulles as the Secretary of State for Eisenhower, and he was a major shareholder in the UFC. And his brother, Alan, was the head of the CIA. So you had these two brothers with an interest in the United Fruit Company. And that led to, or helped lay the groundwork, according to this book, for the Guatemalan, the coup in Guatemala in 1954. So the CIA convinced, Alan Dulles convinced Eisenhower, we've got to topple this democratically elected president of Guatemala because he's kind of leaning to the left. We need to get rid of him. And Eisenhower went along with it. This is an amazing book. I want to read it to you.
So we sent in forces that did the
The
coup.
CIA had its own little air force, its own planes, and helped facilitate the transition to their choice for president.
Oh, okay.
It led to 36 years of civil war, and they're still digging up bodies in rural areas of Guatemala because the military junta that we had supported went into these villages and wiped out indigenous villages. 36 years of civil war. Too. So the coup in 1909, this is in Nicaragua again, with help from the U.S., initiated several decades of political instability between, and again, the terms they use are liberals and conservatives. U.S. Marines entered Nicaragua in 1912, beginning 2 decades of guerrilla warfare and civil war. So this helps you understand why they're not so crazy about us in Nicaragua. U.S. Marines entered Nicaragua, and Augusto Sandino, a working class man who had a vision of anti-imperialism, challenged the U.S. presidents in Nicaragua. President Hoover and later FDR's good neighbor policy produced a policy of disengagement, and the Marines finally left about 1933 or 34. The problem is that they trained a National Guard to take over their role as peacekeepers. The National Guard in Nicaragua became a tool for the president to then control the people and any sort of discord or tendencies toward revolution. Next. A little bit more about Sandino. He's kind of the national hero. He might be considered the George Washington of Nicaragua. He was a guerrilla leader, very controversial. He became a popular hero, and later his name was used as the Sandinistas revolted against the corrupt U.S.-supported Somoza government from 1979 to 1990. So 11 years of civil war opposed, we were opposing those Sandinistas with the Contras. After a second intervention by U.S. Marines in 1927, Sandino withdrew with several hundred guerrillas to the mountains of northern Nicaragua as he continued to elude capture by U.S. forces and the Nicaraguan National Guard. We never caught him. And if you know any Marine Corps history, the most decorated Marine allegedly is Chesty Puller. This happened, he was stationed there as a lieutenant during this time. Next slide. Following the withdrawal of the U.S. Marines in 1933, Sandino was invited to meet with Anastasio Somoza, who was the head of the National Guard, in an apparent peace conference. But after leaving the conference, he was intercepted and assassinated. So he became a martyr for Nicaragua. Instead of building strong democracies and strong participatory institutions, by the late 1930s, the U.S. had put into place and supported dictatorships in Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and the Dominican Republic. So that National Guard I told you, U.S. Marines trained them, and they became the force that was used not to maintain order, but to establish corrupt dictatorships. Again, my source is that first book I passed around. Next.
What do I do to bring that so that it's without losing both?
I don't know if they can hear us or
Can you guys hear us?
Yes.
There, I muted you, Grant. That's okay. I can mute you from this end.
Okay. Ruben Dario, this is what he said. Quote, "You are the United States. You are the future invader of the Native America that has native blood, that still prays to Jesus Christ and speaks Spanish. The United States are powerful and large. When they shake, a deep trembling passes through the huge backbone of the Andes. Long live Spanish America. 1,000 cubs of the Spanish lion are afield. You, Roosevelt, would need to become, by command of God himself, the terrible sharpshooter and the mighty hunter to hold us in your iron claws." That was their celebrated poet, Ruben Dario. I visited his home in Leon a couple years ago. Oh, the pictures are coming up. This is the Managua Cathedral on the main square. In 1972, the earthquake devastated the main square. The cathedral is considered unsafe. It still stands there as sort of a memorial, but there's no services held in there. And the boy on the right was the second child I sponsored in Nicaragua. He's 22 years old now, and I visited him for Christmas. I got another picture at the end. Okay, so now the revolution, 1979. There's 3 causes listed from my source: dissatisfaction from the middle class business community, liberation theology movement at its grassroots after Vatican II motivated Nicaraguans and Salvadorans to seek better lives through spiritual and social change. Many in Latin American Catholic churches argued that, quote, "the church was not constituted by the institution and the hierarchy, but rather the community of the faithful." And the third cause was a Marxist guerrilla movement by young men and women for the overthrow of the Somoza government, the one that we had put into place. By this time, it was his son, Taco, who was in charge. Taco. Or Tacho. Taco or Tacho. Okay, so liberate the priests. The priests advised this. Priests and nuns emphasized Jesus, the revolutionary figure, the Christ of the poor, the oppressed, and the downtrodden. Instead of telling the poor masses to accept their suffering and the status quo, waiting for their reward in heaven, activists worked to help the masses change their lives in this world. Priests argued that to be a good Christian, one had to behave like a good Christian. Belief required action. This message helped produce revolution with so many poor people and sent the message, you don't have to accept powerlessness. So now the people are coming together under this liberation theology, and this became a threat to those dictatorships in El Salvador and Nicaragua.
Priest of the Catholic Church.
Yes, priests of the Catholic Church.
Huh.
Okay, so the revolution in '79 and El Salvador's civil war in 1980 began after the Romero assassination. So this is one of my heroes of the faith, Archbishop Romero, who was later made a saint by the Catholic Church about 3 years ago, maybe 4. Guerrillas supported by Cuba, Panama, and Costa Rica revolted against the Somoza. Against Somoza, who fled to Miami in July 1979, and he was later assassinated in Paraguay the year later. Reagan secretly funded a counter-revolution called the Contras after the U.S. Congress refused to fund that opposition war. They refused to fund it, and so Oliver North and Reagan, whether he approved it directly or indirectly, sold arms to the Islamic regime in Iran, and that money, they called it arms for hostages. Ostensibly, they were trying to rescue or repatriate 5 hostages, but the money that they gained from that sale, the delivery of those weapons was by the Israelis. They convinced the Israelis to do it, but Oliver North facilitated the transition of the money and the arms. El Salvador's civil war also began when Archbishop Romero was assassinated on March 24, 1980, while preaching in the chapel attached to the Hospital for the Poor and Indigenous Salvadorans. A few years ago, he was proclaimed a saint, as I mentioned. The irony is, and I heard this from my tour guides, is Romero went to the U.S. Congress before his death, and he pleaded with the U.S. Congress, do not send any more money to El Salvador, because they're using that money to buy guns and ammunition to be used against people in rural areas, the people who were opposed to the regime in the military junta in El Salvador. And so that was the beginning of the end for Romero, once he had done that. The Civil War began, the last slide. The Civil War also began after Bishop was assassinated. USA supported El Salvador's military junta, likely responsible for Romero's assassination. And the Sandinistas supported the Salvadoran leftists. It's kind of a complicated web of events. Hard to understand. Okay, this is the little chapel where he was assassinated, again, attached to the Hospital for the Poor and Indigenous People in San Salvador. He just lived a real humble little home. Next. There's his little bedroom, little bed there. And on the right are some pictures, post-assassination pictures from the chapel. Next. Okay, lots of time.
That's all right.
Daniel Ortega. Okay, he was the original revolutionary in 1979. Born in 1945, the guerrilla leader, member of the Sandinista junta, took power in '79, and now he's the elected president of Nicaragua. Now, one of the things he did, I guess I'll wait and mention this later on the next slide, is he's made himself dictator for life, basically.
Yeah.
And who else has done that?
I don't know. Everybody in South America.
Mr. Putin, too.
Son of a veteran son of a veteran of the peasant army of Cesar Augusto Sandino. Ortega moved to Managua in mid-1950s. In 1963, he went underground and became a member of the Sandinista National Liberation Front, FSLN. By 1967, he was in charge of that movement against the Somoza family. One of the 5 members of the Sandinista junta, Ortega was named coordinator of the junta in 1981, and 3 years later was elected president of Nicaragua. However, he was defeated in his bid for re-election in 1990 by Chamorro. I believe that his, Violeta, her daughter, I believe, or son, were exiled from the Nicaragua. He's created laws now that if you oppose the government, it's considered treason, and you will lose your citizenship and you'll be deported. So it's a little bit like Putin. You know, any opposition is declared as treason, and of course now he's up the ante and people are jailed for life now. I think that's one of the things he's put through. Ortega reemerged as the FSLN candidate for president in May 1996, was defeated again. But let's see, he was also the candidate in 2001, and although he's defeated, he captured 42% of the vote. But anyway, by 2006, finally, after 3 times being defeated, he finally won with strong support from Nicaragua's poor. So the middle-class business community largely opposes him because they recognize the U.S. and U.S. involvement, especially like tourism. They wanted the middle-class community wanted to become more and more like Costa Rica, or eco-terrorism. You know what I'm trying to say? Tourism. And it was happening. They were moving toward the model of Costa Rica. But once the poor really elected Ortega in 2006, things began to go downhill. Now, I started going there in 2007 to visit the kids that I sponsored through Compassion. So this is the Venezuelan connection. After the first year in office, Ortega's critics questioned his motives when he began restricting news coverage, denying journalists access to government reports, and aligning himself with leftist Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez, who would provide discounted oil and gas supplies. So near the main plaza, the hotel where I stayed, is this huge, this is like 40 feet tall. This lit up, I took this during Christmas time, this big lit up display of Hugo Chavez. He's become one of their national heroes because he was along with Russia, he was the only friend they had for many years during the revolution. And of course, he's since passed away from cancer, and Maduro has taken his place. Okay, so Ortega became the dictator for life in 2009, making his wife Rosario the vice president. Isn't that nice? Yeah. In July 2009, Ortega announced his intention to amend the Constitution so he could be reelected to a second consecutive term, violating their Constitution at the time. In response to a petition from Ortega and more than 100 mayors, the Nicaraguan Supreme Court lifted the constitutional ban on consecutive re-election, allowing him to run in the 2011 presidential election. While Ortega remained popular with disadvantaged Nicaraguans, it was a different matter with the middle class, as I said, who became disenchanted with what they saw as his increasingly authoritarian rule and the lack of transparency of his government. Critics of the Ortega regime were also quick to point out that some of the profits, probably all of the profits from the Venezuelan oil money had been invested in private companies that were controlled by Ortega's. So he's enriched his family and friends. And this is where Nicaragua stands today in terms of religion and facts. The population is almost 7 million, but many have fled to Costa Rica and also to the US because of this regime. As you can see, this Catholic is still the dominant religion. Can't see it, I think it says 50%.
50 and 20.
50 and 33%. 33%. So there's a growing evangelical movement in Nicaragua, including Jose, the one that was in the picture. He is preparing, even as we speak, to preach on Romans 13 to his church. So he's teaching English in a Christian school, and he's preparing to preach Romans 13. So I keep telling him I think he's gonna end up in ministry and not some other choice. It's the largest country in Central America. And to the north are Honduras, to the south is Costa Rica. Now, when you go to Costa Rica, and some of you have been there, I had 2 tour guides say that people, they immigrate from Nicaragua to El Salvador or to Costa Rica to pick the coffee beans because the Costa Ricans won't do it. So in effect, the Nicas, the Nicaraguans, they call them Nicas, they do the dirty work, the jobs that Costa Ricans won't do. And so the word I got a couple of years ago is that the population of Costa Rica is 4.5 million, and 1.5 million of that total are Nicaraguans. It's a good deal for them because their kids get a good education, they get health care, but they work for it. They pick the coffee beans. So, okay, that's Costa Rica. Okay, so Wall Street Journal, this is recent news. 890 migrant bodies recovered by U.S. authorities in 2022, a 56% increase. Title 42 is set to expire May 11th, which is the same day that the COVID emergency declaration ends. And so ending with it is Title 42. Biden in January had said migrants caught trying to cross the border illegally would be barred from requesting asylum in the USA if they didn't ask for asylum in the countries they crossed. So for most of them, that means in Guatemala, Honduras, or Mexico, they had to go online to an app and request asylum. And then if they didn't do that, then they would be, sent back. But from what I've heard on this 60 Minutes story, I put the link there. It's an excellent interview, 12 minutes, almost 13 minutes, regarding the southern border problems. From what they said in this interview, this 60 Minutes interview, it wasn't, it's not working well. And it was sort of a stopgap anyway until the May 11th Title 42 expires. And I just heard this past week that one of the options that Biden's administration is considering is setting up offices in, they said Colombia, and I think the other one might have been Mexico. They were going to set up these pre-asylum places or boards where people could go in order to be evaluated for asylum, whether they qualified for asylum. Now, what my experience, and from what I've heard from people that I still communicate with, is that the triangle countries, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, that's where extortion is the #1 crime, as well as domestic abuse. When I went to Honduras 10 years ago, I did a city tour, and it was just me and the driver. And he said, if I don't pay the gangs, they will kill me. I said, well, what about the Marriott? I'm staying at the Marriott. And do they do the same thing with them? He said, no. That's a big corporation. They have a lot of their own security. He says, but the small companies, the taxi drivers, the people like me, if we don't pay those gangs, we'll turn up dead. And so a lot of people are fleeing Honduras. I think Honduras is probably the most dangerous place for those people living there. Not necessarily for tourists, but for those people. El Salvador has elected a president, Bukele, and he's got an 85% popularity rating because he's rounding up a lot of the gang members and putting them into high security prisons. So he's really attempting to change the course of events in El Salvador. And there's still places in El Salvador you wouldn't visit, but they've come a long ways into securing their country and making it safer for visitors. Now, Nicaragua is a little different. You don't have the roaming gangs and the drugs like you do in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. The real danger is to the people themselves. If they protest against the government, they'll disappear. Just like during the Dirty War, it was called the Dirty War in Argentina and Uruguay, where people between 76 and 82, where people just disappeared. Their son, their husband would go up, they take them up into a plane and push them out the door. And there are still mothers to this day protesting in front of the Casa de Rosado Rosada in Buenos Aires, mothers that are still seeking information about their sons or husbands who disappeared during that time. Oh, and here we go. 2 reasons I'm still involved in Nicaragua. Hansel with his brother on the left. Well, Hansel on the left side gave me this shirt for Christmas. He had it handmade. And his brother, Derek, AKA Isaac, he gave me this hat. Yep.
Nice.
And there's Jose and his mother. This is at a resort. This is where I went for Christmas. So I visited the 2 of them. And her name is Salvadora. She proclaimed to me that she says she's a proud Sandinista. She told me, she said, I'm a Sandinista, but not a Danielista. Because Daniel Ortega is the president. So she doesn't support the president. And that was our trip in Ometepe Island. An island with 2 volcanoes in the middle, well, not the middle, but it's off to the side of that big lake I talked about, Lake Nicaragua. And so I went down there to visit them for probably 12 or 13 times. And each time I worked on his swimming skills. So he was out there swimming in the surf, good swimmer. And now, like I said, he's teaching English and in a Christian school. And this is the organization that promoted that sponsorship. Compassion. This is just like a 1 minute, if it'll play that.
Okay.
This is on the Compassion website. Compassion.
This. Sorry, I can't turn it down.
Passion Sunday was either this week or last week, but this organization is a little different. First of all, it's a Christian organization. They make no bones about it. And what's different about this organization is it's not a bunch of us gringos going down there and telling them what to do. These are local people in local churches who identify these children from these families. A lot of them come from families where dad has already left or mom has kicked him out because of abuse or alcoholism. And Jose now sometimes calls me his daddy because his dad left. And he's had some other struggles to work through that I don't feel it's appropriate to share with you, but essentially his life has been improved through the ministry of compassion and through my sponsorship. So I've written him letters, I visited him, and just about all the kids I've sponsored, I have visited them at one time or another, including the one I mentioned in the Dominican Republic. He's talking to me now or chatting with me on Facebook. He's learned a computer skill. He's learned English. This is the one in Santo Domingo. And he's doing well. He's doing well in Santo Domingo. So Jose and Hansel, I'm still in contact with, and again, through my chat, Facebook chat. And well, that's the organization. And again, it operates through the local church. And primarily evangelical churches, I would say, in Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, certainly. Any questions?
Got about 13 minutes left. Let's.
More time than I've got in
Discussion.
How much is the sponsorship of the child?
$38 a month. And in most countries, it lasts until they're 22. They've extended it from 18 to 22 now. In Nicaragua, I think it's still 18 is the cutoff. It's where they graduate.
We sponsor a couple through partnership through World Hope. You know anything about that?
No, but I've heard of World Vision. There's Children International.
Yeah, it's different from World Vision.
Yeah, Children International is secular. They don't charge quite as much, and it's secular, so it doesn't pretend, or profess to be Christian. So there are other organizations that do sponsor kids.
Eric, what can America do, if anything, to improve the quality of life all through those countries to stop the outflow of people trying to come to America?
Well, this is just my opinion, but I've always felt like if every family would sponsor one child from Central America, I think it would go a long ways. It wouldn't eliminate problems at the border, but I think it would go a long ways. Again, from my experience with Hansel and Jose and Haley, spelled Geily. From those kids that I've sponsored, I just think that they're given hope. And that's the biggest thing that they gather from these sponsorship is hope. They don't send them a lot of money. They don't send them a lot of money, but they do give them annual physicals, dental checkup, school uniform, because in most countries, they have to have a school uniform to go to school. And if they don't get that school uniform, they don't go to school. In a lot of those countries. They get them a pair of shoes. Because I taught marine biology at Rock Canyon, I learned all about parasites. Like 1/4 of the world's population has the hookworm disease, which happens when children walk around on the bare earth. I'm not talking about rocky yard, grassy yards in Highlands Ranch, but dirt, when they walk barefoot in dirt areas on the dirt, these little hookworms come in through the soles of their feet. And it's a very debilitating parasite disease. Yeah, so it's it does fulfill a lot of their needs. And you can send extra money, like for Christmas or
Do you
birthdays.
have to go down there in person?
No, you don't have to go down there at all. You send money to the headquarters, which is in Colorado Springs. They have a headquarters down there, and when you send that money to them, then they send the money to the local church, which then gives the family those things I mentioned. So it goes through Colorado Springs. So if you write a letter, it goes through translators in Colorado Springs before it gets to. And when they write a letter back, they have translators in their projects. They call them development centers. And it gives the kids a place to go after school, because in Nicaragua, they're only going to school half a day. So you drive, you're driving down the road at noon and you see all these kids in uniform walking alongside the road. They're going home because they had school that morning. So it's half the day. So in the afternoon, the kids who aren't sponsored, they have nowhere to go. They're going to, if they're sponsored, they go to the developmental centers, and they learn skills on the computer. They learn hygiene, wash your hands after you go to the bathroom. They learn Bible. But the ones who don't have the sponsorship, they're scooped up by the gangs who become their friends.
Eric, do you mind? I'm 2 for 1. You can either answer one or both if you have time. The impact of drugs and cartels in Nicaragua. And I'm thinking in terms of what the mafia sometimes could do in Sicily, but the pros and cons on that, and how that has influenced the political and social aspects. Then secondly, evangelicals and Catholics are benefiting from the immigration of South America. Mary and I were visiting briefly Willowbrook, very affluent suburb of Chicago, as you know, 20,000 members. They have a very strong outreach to the Hispanic, Latino population. Are we as mainliners missing the boat somewhat as far as growth and expansion by not trying to be more aggressive in absorbing? And what are our chances in doing so? Either one of those 2 questions.
That was an awful lot.
Sorry.
I'm not sure how to answer both of those. Can you give me the first one again?
Well, the impact of the cartels, the
Okay,
hand that giveth and taketh away, and
Yeah.
impact on the social mindset and the pros and cons.
I could be wrong, but my impression, again, after 14 or 15 visits down there since 2007, my impression is they don't have the cartels in Nicaragua like they do in Mexico or Honduras. The former president of Honduras was recently extradited to the US to face charges as a narco-terrorist. The former president. And so the drugs are funneled through Guatemala and Honduras. But to my knowledge, Nicaragua is not a big transit zone for cocaine, because most of the leaves, the coca leaves, are grown and harvested in Peru and primarily in Colombia to this day. But the production sites for cocaine are not in Bolivia, because Bolivia is really poor. Most of the production facilities are in Peru and Colombia. So when I say it's fun to go to Colombia and Colombians like Americans, I'm talking about the major cities. Cartagena is probably the city that people primarily visit if they go to Colombia. Bogota would be number 2. But the cities, I didn't have any problem during the day. But in the capital, in Bogota, they told me, don't go out after night. Don't go out at night. Now it's different. In Cartagena, it's a walled city. And I was walking around at night all the time in Cartagena. It's a very safe city. And that's where a lot of the tourism funnels as they go to Cartagena. So I guess I don't believe that Nicaragua is a major player in the drug cartel transit.
Have you ever felt in danger in your travels?
It wasn't until Christmas time when I went to Nicaragua to visit Jose and his mother, that was the first time I felt a little uncomfortable. After only when I would leave the hotel to go to like a local mall with one of these guys, then I get the stares. And yeah, and the gringo stares. Or maybe it was the age difference, to be walking with one of these kids that I sponsored. In any case, it was uncomfortable at times. We were pulled over when I went in July of 21, when I went to Ometepe Island. We were pulled over because it was the other day they celebrate as Revolution Day is July 17th. And it marks the 79 revolution. So there's all these red and black flags. And we got pulled over, and I don't know what you call him, militia guy or security guy. He opened up the trunk, and of course, there's only luggage in there, and he let us go. There was no bribe or anything like that. But that was the first time that I had been pulled over, and it was the first time upon landing in Managua that I had to go to a white table and have my luggage picked through. They poke through your luggage. And I said, what are you looking for? And he said, food or drugs? He said food. So he pulled out this can of Spam, because these guys like Spam down there. The mothers, fry it up with their eggs. So he pulled out the Spam and he said, I should charge you for this. I talked to another American at the hotel in Nicaragua, and she said she had the same experience. After the luggage went through the scanner, which it always does, they always do that to make sure you're not bringing guns in. Then I was directed over to this white table, one of these. And so it was a little uncomfortable. I never felt in great danger. I just, like I said, it was just a little bit uncomfortable at times. The other times I haven't felt that way. I felt pretty secure because I'm almost always with the organization, with compassion people that are taking me in a van someplace. I'm not renting a car. I won't rent a car in Nicaragua or Guatemala. Question?
It just sounds like this whole talk is very confusing regarding the constant turnover of leadership and the lack of democracy operating in the whole Central American area.
Yes.
And the United States hasn't helped. Every time they go in, they seem to create more chaos than they do. They go in maybe with the right intentions, but they wind up getting corrupted also.
Well, and you speak to my opinion on the formation of the CIA. When the CIA was formed after World War II under the National Security Act, under President Truman, it established the Department of Defense, the Department of the Air Force, the National Security Council, and the CIA. And the reason why according to one of my books on Eisenhower and Truman also, is that Truman wanted a daily briefing on events around the world so that Pearl Harbor didn't happen again. That was his motive
Yeah.
for establishing the CIA. But what happened very quickly, and this is in the book on the CIA, what happened very quickly is within the CIA itself, there was a split between analysis and covert action. And Eisenhower had a penchant for covert action because he had seen covert action work well in World War II. So he had a natural affinity for covert action. And so eventually Allen Dulles came in later and they had all these different ideas. Oh, here's what we can do in Guatemala. And here's what we can do. Here's what we can do in Iran. What did they do in Iran? The CIA helped topple the democratically elected president, Mossadegh of Iran. And and then they brought back the Shah, who was living in Rome. He was exiled. They brought him back. We know how that one worked out, right?
Well,
was our guy.
He was our guy.
We meddle in other people's affairs and many times, we don't make good decisions either. And the fact that we're making decisions for a foreign country doesn't make sense to me. Sometimes I think we just should get out of meddling and leave, advise, but not go in and actually try to, change people. These are cultures that are so old and their belief systems so,
Afghanistan.
trying to give democracy as we know it.
Before 9/11, George Bush said the age of the era of nation building is over. He said that before 9/11.
He's right. I mean, every
But
time
it didn't happen. We still went into
we're still
Iraq,
meddling down there,
Afghanistan.
yeah, around the world we meddle.
Are we or other countries meddling still in Latin America?
Well, China now has become a big player in Central America. They're offering a lot of, in South America and Central America, they're offering money. But with the Chinese, the money doesn't come free of charge. It comes with strings attached. Yeah.
And it's one totalitarian, the government, taking over another one. We don't.
Yep, Pinochet in Chile is another one. We got rid of Allende and put Pinochet in his place. And again, another CIA engineered coup. That didn't work out very well either.
Right below our borders, and I know that we're not gonna stem the tide of immigration unless we get really strict, because there's people gonna come over.
We'll see what happens after May
No
11th.
matter what, but our relationship with Mexico, we have this love-hate thing, because we know that they're responsible, the cartels, the president looks the other way. For the car, in fact, he's probably on the take, who knows?
I think we had one more question in the back.
Yeah, we're about out of time, but Mary, go ahead.
If you could please send out information about the compassion.
I will, sure.
Yeah, and the link is on the last slide also.
Yes.
Compassion.com is a pretty easy link.
Eric, you also know Pure Vida, right? Because that's the
That's the slogan in Costa Rica.
right. So that's
Yeah.
the nonprofit org that a lot of our members of our church go through.
Oh, okay.
Guatemala, to
Pura Vida,
their children.
Pure Life,
Yeah.
Pura Vida.
That's the mission that I got to go on
Oh.
years ago, and several others have got to do that as well. But that's right here out of Englewood.
Yeah,
We send money to.
Oh, okay.
And they sponsor.
I didn't know about that. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Good presentation discussion. See you next week for Thomas Jefferson's Life and Faith. Presented.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. For part of the- Oh, okay.